Thank you. Thank you. All right, class. Settle down. Settle. There will be an exam at the end of this. I'm a professor. What did you expect? One of my favorite Broadway shows, actually, Spamalot, takes great work of historical documentation, takes exception to the usual rule about saying make sure your cell phones are turned off by saying, will you please turn your cell phones on because the show is crap, actually. So if you want to talk among yourselves, or, that's fine. I just noticed that my publisher, in his wisdom, have just brought out the audiobook of The American Future. And it was sort of a real vote of confidence in the mischief of the title, that if you look at I regret to say, ominously unabridged reading, which is wonderful to listen to, especially if you're suffering from insomnia, it's a nice way to get to sleep. But the vote of confidence, which had me worrying a bit, it says, the American future, and then in tiny, tiny, tiny little letters underneath, a history. So the notion was that I would be a prophet, really, rather than someone who talks about the past. But the entire point of the project was not really to survey the whole meaning of American history. Even my temerity doesn't quite reach that far. But to say something, really, which is a Washington statement, that paradoxically, in a country which gets a bad rap elsewhere in the world, wrongly in my view, having lived here half my life, having a short attention span, history is actually the meat and drink. I mean, this tent is a testimony to this. You hearing from brilliant historians like John Meacham and in their different ways, Ken Burns, is a testimony to how much history has actually meant to American people. I was made aware of this a long time ago, actually, when I was a feckless young faculty member in Cambridge. And two adorable old ladies, I rather think from Virginia or North Carolina, were walking through the ornamental Tudor court of my Cambridge college. And within my own hearing, one said, "Oh, Mabel, don't you just love history? It's so old." Those of us who are getting up there know what she means, but there's some way in which history is always young, too. Here's the extraordinary paradox about the American relationship to history, I think, is that, of course, in its fundamental ways, the United States of America came into being as a separation from the past, a separation from monarchy, a separation from the authority of mere precedent. But on the other hand, people like Jefferson in particular, who was an avid borrower of history books from one of the earliest circulating libraries, not in Philadelphia, but at Williamsburg, Virginia, were very conscious that what they were recovering was an old historic tradition of liberty. So just at the same time that Jefferson was writing drafts of the Declaration of Independence, he was delving back into the debates about democracy that had taken place more than a century before, during the interregnum, the period that ended with the execution of Charles I. So from the beginning, there was this sense that Americans were really rescuing a tradition of freedom that had been betrayed by the English and the British themselves, betrayed by George III, betrayed by the Redcoats. So history, yes, very, very old, but perpetually young. And I say this now here in Washington, this particular moment, because this book and the series was indeed an attempt to marry two things that you would think ought never to be married up together: on-the-road reporting of the campaign, which we followed with the BBC team through 2008, and windows back into the past. And it struck me very early on that the person who was going to win the election was the person who could tell America the best, most penetrating, and most fearlessly honest story about itself. And that person, I think, did indeed, some of you have a different opinion, go on to win the election. It's not that John McCain is in any sense oblivious or indifferent to history. It's just that Barack Obama was intensely saturated in its difficult meaning. How many of you, were any of you here on Inauguration Day? I was here, yeah, freezing ourselves to death, but warmed by our own sense of the exhilaration of the historical moment. And do you remember, Obama essentially gave us, as he is prone to do, possibly excessively, even for a professor of history like me, he gave us essentially a historical lecture. I thought how extraordinary it was that we had that journey with Barack Obama on that violently cold day, which went from, it went through a kind of procession of moments of epic suffering, from people who braved all the worst things that the ocean could bring them as slaves or as destitute immigrants, to people who are suffering real hardship out there on the frontier. And the meaning, I think, that Obama essentially, what he seized in the campaign and in the election was a sense of saying, this is not an election where it's business as usual. America is at a crossroads. It's at a crossroads in the way in which it relates to the world, in which it thinks hard and painfully about the causes for which we spill the blood of our children and our treasure. It's at a crossroads in the way we understand the relationship of our government to our people. And I think it was because actually those big historical themes resounded over and over again that he sort of took charge rhetorically of what the campaign was about. He was also, I think, unafraid, remarkably, to sort of back off from a smiley face view of history. History comes essentially often in two flavors. One is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves to make us feel good. And there's nothing really particularly wrong with that, but it runs the danger simply of an exercise in self-congratulation. John was just here, and I love his book about Andrew Jackson, but I want Andrew Jackson to be removed from the $20 bill. Andrew Jackson was our first, most aggressive, most adamant ethnic cleanser. And it wasn't, you know, I heard the question quite rightly asked about the Indian removal. This is a painful truth. Doesn't mean to say we're bad as a nation. Doesn't mean to say we have to wring our hands about everything in our American past. But it is also true that in 1829-30, when the Five Nations were deported across the Mississippi with a loss of between a quarter and a third of all of those who had to undertake that terrible Trail of Tears, voices at the time, like Davy Crockett, for example, and Edward Everett said, this will forever be a stain on our national past. We have violated our most solemn undertakings, those undertaken between the Cherokee and Thomas Jefferson in particular. And, you know, none of us should ever feel ashamed about our American identity, but it is the great glory, strength, and virtue, thank God, of the Western historical tradition that we are grown up enough to tell honest stories about ourselves. When does that tradition begin? It begins with Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. Why did Thucydides, who was a general who fought on a remote theater in that campaign, write it? He didn't write it in order to say how impeccably behaved the Athenians had been, how all the decisions of their generals and their politicians had been drenched in virtue and foresight. He wrote it to get to the great tragic denouement of the expedition to Syracuse, the expedition of great overreach. Thucydides was not afraid to write something for the Athenians so that democracy would survive, but survive on an historical bedrock of truth. And that is the difference, everybody here, between us and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's definition of history. What got to me in those notorious remarks about which I waxed slightly wrathful in the pages of the Financial Times was the point when Ahmadinejad said, why is it that there's been no research on the Holocaust? Excuse me. Who would like to join me in a personal expedition of ambush to bring him to the Holocaust Memorial Museum and lock him in for about a year?